All right, welcome to our last day of our conference. Super excited to be hosting this conference, and it's a fundraiser for our Midwifery Service Fund, which allows people to access midwifery care on a sliding scale with the mission of making midwifery care accessible. I want to thank Adrienne, who's with us today, for donating her time to come and teach us about Partus Preparator herbs. So I want to honor the stolen land, native land that I'm currently on in Colorado, which is Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I will introduce Adrienne Leeds, who's doing a presentation on Partus Preparator herbs. So excited to hear about that.
Hi, it's great to see familiar faces. I've been an herbalist for a while now, and I've been attending births in one form or another since 2001, and I play with placentas and did most of my midwifery training in South Carolina with about a month in Peru, and then we moved back to Colorado in 2017. I love being back here. I feel very alive and at home here. So what is a Partus Preparator herb or herbal blend, as we're going to talk about? It's an agent that strengthens and helps prepare the body for parturition or for birth. And historically, they were used to make labor shorter, easier, and less painful. And when did people start using them? Like historically around the world, there have been traditions everywhere for things people should take when they're pregnant and when they're approaching labor and when they're in labor and postpartum. I just learned on Facebook recently, there's a Greek tradition where midwives recommend poppy leaf tea after 39 weeks to tone the uterus and prepare for birth. We're going to talk about North American herbs and herbal blends, specifically these formulas that came into vogue in the 19th century. And we're going to do a brief history about what was going on in the time of herbalism and medicine in the 19th century. And then I'll talk about the herbs, the blends, and then some specific herbs and kind of their indications from ethnobotany and from eclectic medicine and physiomedical medicine and how people use them in modern times. And we can discuss afterwards. I also did a survey in March back through January of this year. I did a survey of midwives, about 76 respondents, talking about, do they use these blends? Who do they recommend them for? And it was really interesting to me because what they are historically recommended for and the women they were historically recommended for and their history are very different than how people are using them now. So I'm curious to hear what you all have to say about it too. And I have no cards because I'm a geek, so you see me looking down, that's why. So the history of using herbs in North America, of course, we have Native Americans, as Rachel shared, we're on their land. And plants are our original pharmacy, they're our original medicines. And looking at ethnobotany can be somewhat problematic just because it has a colonialist and biased perspective, of course. But the written records are really just what we have. And it's not clear whether what was told to the people who were recording the information was necessarily even true. So, take the ethnobotanical use with somewhat of a grain of salt. Thomsonian herbalism and physiomedicalism really are similar. Physiomedicalist tradition grew out of Thomsonian herbalism. And Samuel Thomson was a poor farmer. It was really a populist movement. He studied Hippocrates and he learned from the people around him and from Native Americans and from folk traditions around him. And he came up with what's now known as vitalism, which is basically the vital force. And his way of approaching the vital force was looking at derangement of vital fluids and loss of heat causing disease. So in his mind, to restore health, you restore heat and you eliminate toxins. And he did that a lot with purgative herbs like lobelia and with cayenne, like very strong, heroic, stimulating kind of herbs. And then the physiomedicalists were a little bit later. They had a couple schools. There was one in Ohio in 1835, and there was one in Georgia. And they really used the vital force as their concept to balance circulation, eliminate toxins, as Samuel Thomson did. This concept actually very much influenced British herbalism. It made it back across the pond, and it also influenced frontier medicine. They wrote books for the pioneers with folk remedies who were traveling west. And you'll notice too, a lot of the plants that we talk about, I'll say, where do they grow? They grow in eastern woodlands. And if you think about it, what North America looked like at the beginning of the 19th century, the United States of America barely extended beyond the Mississippi River. So it's quite interesting. If our country had been different, I wonder if we would be using different regional herbs at that point. The eclectic tradition was about 1829 to 1939, and it peaked around 1909, right before Abraham Flexner published his report. And they also called themselves Reformed medicine. And these were men who were learned, they were gentlemen, they had some formal education. Some of them actually went and studied at European medical schools too. And they really, they thrived in creating specific indications for plants. They had a very complete energetic system, looking at tone in the body and organ systems. They looked at excess and deficient, hot, cold, whether a tissue had good tone, lack of tone, too much tone. And they often used the whole plant in their preparations. And they left us a vast amount of literature. The physiomedicalists did too, to a certain degree, but the eclectic literature, I had so much fun going back because a lot of it's been put online. So I had a lot of fun going back and reading, what did Wicks Felter say? What did the Lloyd brothers say? What did Dr. John King, who was also an obstetrician, say about the use of these plants? And the specific indications that they came up with were really to look at, here's a plant and we're going to match it to a particular pattern of symptoms in an organ or an organ system. And they really shined. A lot of modern herbalists still look back at the eclectic indications for the use of plants. I want to mention the US Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary, just because I will be talking about the plants in individuals later, and that they were listed in these two databases for a long time, well into the 20th century, a lot of these plants. And so the US Pharmacopoeia was established in 1820, and it codified legally recognized standards for drug substances as well as therapeutic products. The National Formulary was established in 1888 by the American Pharmaceutical Association, and they listed standards for excipients and botanicals. And then those two databases or organizations merged in 1975, and they're still in existence, and very few botanicals left in there, unfortunately. It's mostly pharmaceutical drugs. And of course, folk herbalism is the medicine of the people. And there was a time when everyone was an herbalist. It wasn't a special thing. Everybody knew how to use plants as medicine. And it's great to see there's been a resurgence in our culture that we're weaving this knowledge back in. So what was happening in regular medicine, or what we now call allopathic medicine? Looks like my slides are on a bit of a delay, so there we go. So common practices of the day in regular medicine made a lot of people very frightened and reluctant to approach doctors of the time. There was bloodletting, there was blistering, which is also called vesiculation, purging, making people poop a lot, puking with emetics, mercury as the use of medicine. Mercury was in several different formulas, including something called calomel, and there was something like the blue something, and mercury was very commonly given as medicine. And George Washington was killed by bloodletting and blistering. He had a sore throat, and he was elderly, but had it not been for all the massive blood they let out of him, he might have survived his sore throat. At birth in the earliest 20th century, physicians of the time used chloroform and morphine, and then scopolamine, twilight sleep came into play about 1914. And their way of stimulating labor, they had at the beginning, they used ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye, and it causes very violent tetanic, like very strong contractions that are uncontrollable. So it wasn't the most refined medicine. Who and where? So physicians at the time in the 19th century they didn't really have a standardized education. Some of them did go study in Europe, but a lot of them didn't even have 4 years of standard education. Some of them maybe 2. They mostly worked in cities, and mostly it was the people who came to see them were wealthier and people who could afford them. And so it was mostly urban middle and upper class folks who went to doctors. And birth, in around 1900, doctors attended about 50% of births, and less than 5% of births took place in hospitals. So I was thinking about the Partus preparatory formulas that were created by the Thomsonian and physiomedicalist doctors, and then by the eclectic physicians. I was wondering who really were the people who were taking these formulas. Were they, middle and upper class women who had access to funds, who had access to these doctors? We don't really know if midwives were recommending it because there's no written documentation about them. And then the Flexner Report in 1910 changed medicine forever. At the time he did his report in the early 1900s, there were 186 regular medical schools, allopathic medical schools in North America, and he included Canada. There were 22 homeopathic schools, 20 naturopathic schools, and about 30 chiropractic and osteopathic and what he categorized as other, which may have included the eclectic medical schools. And then after that, after his report, within about 10 years, there were only about 70 medical schools left. It really changed the face of what was happening in North America and standardized things. So let's look at, and then there's midwifery, of course, which we know around, in the 19th century and early 20th century, who was attending births. There were granny midwives or grand midwives in the South, and they attended everybody. And at first, they weren't really regulated, and then states started to regulate and train them. And so they kept their own bags on the side, and they had their official bag, and then they had their root medicine bag that they didn't share with anybody. And they brought to us the use of cotton and cotton root bark. There were, of course, European descent midwives as well. And also in the early 20th century, there was a smear campaign very organized by the medical society to brand us as dirty and drunk and illiterate and ignorant because they wanted to take birth into the hospitals and into doctors' practices. So they called it the midwife problem. So we don't know if midwives were using these herbs. They might have been, not really clear. So here's the first mother's cordial recipe. It's going to come up in a second. It was written by Dr. P.F. Sweet, who was a Thomsonian practitioner in 1826. And it was in common use by the Thomsonians throughout New England in the 1830s. And this recipe was published by Benjamin Colby in 1846. And this is one of the oldest herbal compound formulas that's been in continuous use in the United States. And the way it's prepared, it's actually prepared as a decoction. So the herbs are boiled and then strained, and then you add sugar and brandy to make a cordial. So it makes it sweet, and then the brandy's there as a preservative. And as it says, its effects are to diminish the sufferings of childbirth, place the mother and child in a state of safety. Thank goodness for this formula. And then there's the dosage there, have some in a little hot water. And in modern times, it's interesting because we've taken these formulas with similar herbs and similar ratios of herbs. But what a lot of people do now is just take the tinctures of each individual herb and mix them together. So it's a different herbal preparation. And sometimes the preparation affects how the herbs work. So anyway, this one was a decoction made into a cordial. And then later on, we have from the eclectic tradition, Dr. King came up with a compound syrup of Michela. And this is the recipe for it. And if you notice, you start by percolating in alcohol. So it's an alcohol, and then they do a water extraction. So it's an alcohol extraction combined with a water extraction. Then he adds sugar and sassafras for flavoring. And it says, strictly speaking, this is not a syrup, but a sweetened infusion. But it's not what we would call an infusion now. What we would call an infusion is herbs that are steeped in water, 4 to 8 hours or overnight as a water extract. This is an alcohol and water extract. So already, within several decades, they've changed how they're preparing these herbs. But the herbs are the same in each, and the proportions are the same in each. It starts with partridge berry, which some people call squaw vine. Don't ever, please, call it squaw vine. Partridge berry helonius, which is also known as false unicorn root, high cranberry, which is cramp bark, and blue cohosh. And it was used as a parturient to promote birth, as a uterine tonic, as an antispasmodic, and it also had a reputation as a nerve tonic. Observations made at the time is that it removed the cramping of the limbs, low back pain, frequently removes the cramps to which some are liable during the later weeks of the uterogestation, is what the eclectic literature says. The later weeks, the cramps. So it's supposed to slow down those annoying Braxton Hicks, what we call them now. Jill Stansberry, who's a modern naturopath and herbalist and author, says that this was used for women with a history of difficult labors, postpartum subinvolution, multiple childbirths, and also was used for threatened miscarriage, a teaspoon every 10 to 15 minutes. It was a noted remedy for chronic miscarriages back in the day, and it was said to be used for weak or nervous women, said to promote easy labor at least 80% of the time. That is the mother's cordial, the compound syrup of Michela. So the next one we're going to talk about is actually this guy. It's Dr. Christopher's birth prep. And Dr. Christopher lived from 1909 to 1983, mostly in Utah, although he was in Washington State for a bit. And he went to school in Canada, actually. He studied at the Dominion Herbal College, which was very influenced by Thomsonian and physico-medical herbalism. So he has lobelia in almost every one of his formulas. And Dr. Christopher created a school. He created over 50 herbal formulas, many books. He was a very well-renowned teacher. And his formulas live on. His family has kept his business going. And so his formula is squaw vine, or partridge berry, as we like to call it now, but I'm going to list, the historical use. Blessed thistle, black cohosh, pennyroyal, false unicorn, red raspberry, and lobelia. And the instructions are, you start at 36 weeks. You take 1 capsule a day. And then at 37 weeks, 2 capsules a day. And then from 38 weeks on until birth, 2 capsules 3 times a day. So 6 capsules total every day until birth. And let's see, the testimonials on his website. One lady said she's had 6 home births. She's used the formula with most. The herbs are so helpful in making her labors so much shorter, and she had very smooth deliveries. Another person had a previous labor for 30 hours. She claims that this formula cut her labor to about 4 hours. Now, who knows if that was first baby, second baby, that could have just been what would have happened anyhow. Another person claims that this formula turned the baby who was breech to a vertex presentation in labor. So there you have it. Polly Jean's formula. This is another very popular one. I'm sorry, there's a delay in the slides. Polly Black was an herbalist and midwife, and she also lived in Utah. And her formula is called the 5-week antenatal formula. She died in 2007. And this is in capsule formula. I should say too, Dr. Christopher's was in capsule formula. And if you look at the historic use, the herbs were in a liquid formula. So already we're getting into slightly different use of the herbs, which we'll talk about for at least blue cohosh can be problematic. Let's see, so Polly Jean's formula is capsules, timing and dosage. She suggests starting at 35 weeks, 1 capsule 3 times a day. Starting at the 2nd week, so at 36 weeks or 4 weeks antenatally, 2 capsules 3 times a day. Increase the 3rd and 4th weeks up to 3 or 4 capsules 3 times a day. Maintain this dosage until delivery. This formula can also be used a week to 10 days postpartum. And she The claims on this website for this formula are that it makes an easier labor and delivery, longer and easier labors for women who have precipitous births, but shorter and easier labors for women who tend to have long labors. More dilation before discomfort arises, and minimizing postpartum bleeding, and a shorter time of the lochia postpartum. And testimonials on her website include that the recovery was quick and easy, that one person having her 4th pregnancy with twins had previous long labors and significant postpartum hemorrhages. She said she got to the hospital fully dilated. The whole process took less than 5 hours, and the doctor was amazed at the lack of blood loss. Another person said they birthed easily in less than 3 hours. Another person said it was their fastest labor of all 6 births from taking Polygene's formula. And there are many other formulas out there. This is an older one. This is Turtle Islands. I've had this in my possession for like 21 years now, and I've never opened it or used it. I've just got it. And this was originally created by Feather Jones, the herbalist, and it's the same as the original Mother's Cordial, but it's got cinnamon in it for flavoring instead of sassafras. And there are many, many others. These are just a list of certain ones that I found online that a lot of people use, or that are sold by like the birth supply companies. They all have really similar herbs in them. I'll just run through a few of them. The Nature Sunshine, black cohosh, squaw vine, or what we now call partridge berry, donquai, butcher's broom, red raspberry. Those are capsules. Mountain Meadows Gentle Birth Formula is a liquid extract. It's got a lot of herbs in it. Blessed Thistle, red raspberry, false unicorn, partridge berry, blue cohosh, ginger, skullcap, motherwort, wild yam, bayberry, and it's in glycerin and water and a little alcohol. It's also available without red raspberry if you're already drinking that as an infusion. And it's also available without the blue cohosh, which is nice. Some people don't want to use that anymore. Some midwives say about this that they see more postpartum hemorrhage when the cohosh is included, the blue, not the black. I'm sorry, it doesn't have black. One midwife observed somebody was 4 centimeters before labor started, which may or may not happen anyway, right? How many of us are checking how dilated people are before labor starts? There are claims that it gives less pain, shorter, easier labors, little to moderate blood loss, better recovery time. So all these formulas are going to have very similar claims as to what they do. Wish Garden is a liquid extract too. Wish Garden's local to the Boulder area. It was started for midwives, and it's very classic: black haw, partridge berry, motherwort, raspberry leaf, and spikenard. Trilite Health is Shonda Parker's company. It's a liquid extract. This is basically the Mother's Cordial formula. And Herb Lore, she makes a pregnancy tea and a pregnancy tea plus, and then the birth prep one is called the pregnancy tea plus tincture. And it is a tincture, it's a liquid extract, and it's basically all the nutritive tonic herbs that you would use in a tea, plus the addition of partridge berry. And she suggests making ice chips from the diluted tincture mixed in water to provide nutrition and fluids during labor. So you can use it prenatally, and then you can also use it during labor, mixed with a little honey and water to make ice chips. Lucy's Garden is capsules. It says it's 7-week antenatal, but they suggest starting at 35 weeks. So the 7 weeks would be if you go all the way to 42. It's recommended 6 to 9 capsules a day. It's very similar to the Polygene formula. It's blue cohosh, blessed thistle, false unicorn, raspberry, motherwort, lobelia, squaw vine or partridge berry, false unicorn, wild yam, bayberry. Sunstone is capsules, pretty similar to a lot of the other formulas. And then Wise Woman Herbals is the Mother's Cordial. Wise Woman Herbals is created by Cheryl Tilgner, who's an herbalist and naturopath and an author. So she kind of kept to the traditional formula from the historic literature. Hers really is a cordial. It's in a base of spring water, honey, vegetable glycerin, and a little bit of alcohol as a preservative. And then there's a Last Frontier midwifery formula. I didn't list it on here. It's considered a uterine toner. And the person who developed it claims to see 4 to 6 hour labors. very low incidence of postpartum hemorrhage. Um, People dilate before labor starting. Let's see, it's a combination of blue cohosh and cotton root. That's it. And it is a liquid extract. So we're going to look at the individual herbs in some of these and herbal actions. And it seems like a lot of you are familiar with herbs already, which is fabulous. So herbal actions, like if you look in any herbal book, it's going to give you a glossary and it's going to do from A to V, from adaptogen to vulnerary. That's one way of classifying herbs, is describing how they work. Another classification, and this 1 through 4 comes to us from Susan Weed and the Wise Woman tradition, looking at herbs, how they act in the body. We can start with nourishing. And nourishing herbs are things like oats, alfalfa, chickweed, mushrooms, things that we take as food, things that have a long history of use. They're completely safe. They're not going to have side effects. They're gentle. You can use them any length of time. And there is going to be some overlap from one category to another. So these are a little, just to simplify, I'm going to, use the categories, but, there's a lot of gray in life. So think about that. Tonic herbs are herbs that have slow, invisible, cumulative actions. They support or build the functionality of an organ or an organ system. So red raspberry is a reproductive tonic. Hawthorn is a cardiovascular tonic. Milk thistle and dandelion are liver tonics. Then we get into the category of sedate or stimulate. And these, I think about, are herbs where when you take something, you feel it, you see it, it has a direct observable action. So these typically you don't take long periods of time. Typically you use them for a reason or for a short duration. Things like oregano oil or prickly ash. Prickly ash is great to enhance circulation or provide warmth to the extremities when you're cold. Valerian is a very classic sedating herb. If you think about, something that's going to have a very calming, observable, direct effect. Cherry bark can be sedating for the lungs, for respiratory tissues. Vitex can be stimulating to the pituitary gland. It can also be tonic, so there's overlap. So yeah, the preparation of the herb affects the results or the category that you're going to see. Sometimes the dose determines also what category it might be in. Oh, let me back up. Heroic and borderline toxic. So category 4, these are plants that sometimes we use in either drop doses or as a large part of a formula. You'll use a little bit of the toxic herb or as a homeopathic preparation. So like poke, for example, poke root can be very toxic. It can be used with respect in small amounts. But we also see it commonly used as phytolacca as the homeopathic preparation. These plants you want to use with wisdom, with respect, with caution. I would consider lobelia to be in this category, like heroic and borderline toxic. A little bit of lobelia in a formula is beautiful. A ton of lobelia, you will puke and never take lobelia ever again. So looking at like preparation affecting the category, if we took a cup of mint tea and we just made a delightful cup of beverage tea and steeped it 15-20 minutes, it would be like maybe a digestive tonic or maybe a little bit stimulating. If we then took that peppermint plant and we decided to distill it and make an essential oil of the peppermint, now we've got a heroic or borderline toxic preparation that we need to use with a much more respectful approach. Blue cohosh, very small amounts of blue cohosh can be a reproductive tonic. And it's described that way in the literature. Large amounts can be stimulant if we prepare it in ethanol versus using it as a decoction, or if we take the powder and put it in a capsule and ingest it as a powder, then we can have more direct stimulating and borderline toxic effects. So the preparation affects the results. And we also need to consider biochemical individuality. Some people are super sensitive. Elders and children in particular are very sensitive. So we need to mind that with our dosages with herbs. And everybody's different. So what works for one person doesn't always work for the next. So let's talk about plants. Waiting for the slide to show up. You all are going to know this first plant. And it's not in the traditional mother's cordial formula. But I'm going to talk about it because it is in some of the herb formulas that I mentioned, and it, I think, is misunderstood in certain ways and misused in certain ways. So when I lived in Charleston, the birth center was recommending this to people at 36 weeks. And I was like, should I go do an herbal class for them? For those, you know, they were nurse midwives. I was like, you guys don't have an herbal background. I would love to come talk to you about how to use this plant because it's a tonic. And you're going to get, sure, a little benefit from taking it 36 weeks on, but you're going to get more benefit if you start taking it, you know, second trimester and building that slow, gradual tonic use. So raspberry rubus idaeus from Mount Ida, the Greek gods, literally means bramble of Ida. There's also rubus strigosus, which is the North American, but you can use any rubus. Any rubus with big leaves is going to give you the benefits. And it grows all over the world. It's temperate climate plant. There's long history of its use to prepare for birth, back to antiquity, back to Greek and Roman times. It was described in Europe to use as nourishment during pregnancy. Culpeper, just talked about it. Nicholas Culpeper, an herbalist in the 17th century, said it was good for too much flowing of the women's courses. So basically, menorrhagia or excess bleeding during menses. He said it was great for that. And we know now it's astringent and it has uterine tonic effects. Let's see, I have a lot on raspberry.
Adrienne, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Is wild raspberry the same thing? Like, you know, up in the mountains you go and you eat the raspberries, it's the same.
Totally.
Okay, cool.
And I think wild raspberry is going to be better because it's going to have more minerals in it. You know, wild plants tend to be a little more, I'm here, growing here, wild, and I haven't been babied in a yard that has a lot of compost and watered regularly. You know, they're like survivor plants. Let's see. I was just looking on my notes for how it was used back in the day. Ethnobotany, yeah. So the ethnobotanical use was said to use as a tea for labor pains, for miscarriage, and for what they called period sickness, whatever that is. Don't know what period sickness is, but they used it for that. And let's see, the eclectics. I'm looking through my notes. Well, herbalists and midwives now, we know we use it as a uterine tonic for painful periods, for heavy periods, for infertility, as a labor prep. A lot of herbalists and midwives will recommend it throughout pregnancy, or at least during the last 2 trimesters as an infusion, or in the Nora tea, which is a classic formula, the nettles, oat straw, raspberry, alfalfa. It's really high in minerals. It's got zinc, potassium, calcium, magnesium, manganese. And some people think its effect on fertility is for people who are low in manganese. It can supply that trace nutrient. People have observed it causes contractions in some people, and some people say it adjusts the tone of the womb. So amphoteric is an herb that means it kind of does what's needed. It has kind of a paradoxical action. It can increase tone or it can decrease tone wherever it needs to go. Some people say it can increase the toning contractions of late pregnancy. So they say if that irritates some people, to back off of it a little bit and maybe not use it. It's not their herb. But it's not a stimulant. It's not going to induce labor. And I think that's a common misconception, that it's something that you take when you want to get things going. And it really, that's not where it shines. It shines as a tonic. Historical use to prevent miscarriage, to reduce uterine swelling, to reduce bleeding, to prevent false labor. It's got a bitter flavor. It's neutral in temperature, and it's very astringent and drying. So especially here in Colorado in our climate, you might want to combine it with something more moistening like shatavari. It would be really nice with shatavari as a women's tonic, because it's going to give you that like yin and yang, that like astringent and moist combined together. So fragrine, there was an article in the Lancet, the British medical journal, in 1941, and the person was discussing the actions of raspberry, and they noticed that yes, it does tone, but it also calms the uterus. It kind of does both. And they attributed this to something they called fragrine or fragrine. And since then, that has taken off, and it's been repeated in so many herbal books, in Susan Weed and in Janine Parvati's books and Rosemary Gladstar's books. And it turns out that's an urban legend. And it's been discussed. There was an herbalist discussion on Facebook a couple of years ago, and it was actually discussed by Paul Bergner back in his Medical Herbalist Journal in 1997, that there's no such thing as fragrine. It just was made up. So if you hear that, and I think I've repeated it in my own handouts to clients, so fragrine does not exist. So that is not why raspberry is a uterine tonic. So if you see that, now you know that it's an urban legend. And evidence-based birth does talk about red raspberry leaf and the 2 studies that were done. And basically, just to summarize, the studies that were done in 1999 and 2001, they were both done in Australia. One said raspberry leaf products. I'm not really sure what forms they used. And the other one used tablets. So not historical. Historically, it was used as a tea. If you take the tablets, you're going to get more of the nutrients out of it, like the minerals. So I don't think the tablets are necessarily a bad thing, but the traditional use is as an infusion. But they concluded it's safely taken in pregnancy with no side effects. There's a low likelihood of prematurity when taking this plant, and also a low likelihood of post-date. So it kind of normalized the gestation period. There were fewer interventions in the raspberry leaf group. Another study showed that it didn't shorten first stage of labor, but it did shorten second stage and decrease the use of forceps. So it's nice to know science validates that raspberry is our friend. The next plant is known as fairy wand, and you'll see why. It's in the Liliaceae family, the lily family. Oh, and I should mention raspberries in the rose family, the Rosaceae family. So this is Helonius, also known as Camelarium luteum or false unicorn root. It's an eastern woodland plant from low moist woods east of the Mississippi, basically. And it is endangered. So this is one of those plants now that I would really only use with caution and respect, not because it's dangerous, but because it's endangered. And we have really, over harvested it. I think it's hard to cultivate. And, the land where it grows has, of course, been encroached upon by human beings, taken away its habitat. So historic use, the ethnobotanical use was that the root was chewed to prevent a miscarriage. The eclectic use, it was as a uterine tonic. Diuretic, it was listed in the US formulary from 1916 to 1947, and it was said to normalize female reproduction. It was used for amenorrhea or lack of periods, as an ovarian tonic, and for prolapse. And in fact, the specific indication for this plant is a dragging sensation in the extreme low abdomen with the inclination to pull up or hold or guard the abdomen. For a bearing down sensation throughout the floor of the pelvis. And it's a bitter tonic. It's known as being warming to the pelvis. Now we know modern use, besides being in these formulas, Anne Fry talks about it in her books as it being like an herbal cerclage. She has seen people who have premature dilation, she's seen it actually reverse that cervical dilation and close things back up. So I think that's really where it shines, is that specific indication. And looking at the eclectics, if somebody's got that like heavy, deep prolapsy feeling, like you would think about for like maybe homeopathic sepia, same thing, that like draggy pelvic feeling. I've also heard, it's not written anywhere, but just from other conversations with other midwives, they've also seen a similar thing happen. They've seen that the cervix will close back up if it's dilating prematurely when they use this plant. So pretty cool, but use it with respect. Here's our next plant, Michella. It's going to be known as squaw vine all over the place. Please don't ever call it squaw vine. Other names for it include squawberry, checkerberry, deerberry, and running fox. The part used is the aerial parts. All the aerial parts are used. The picture on the left is from my yard in South Carolina. That's why it's not, professional, but it's fuzzy, but that's actually, I had it growing wild around me. It grows in the eastern woodlands from north to south. Ethnobotanically, the history is the tea is used in childbirth, and the eclectic literature, Felter, it's let's see, a Partus Preparator, of course. It's a female tonic. It's a miscarriage preventer. It's actually the main herb in the formulas, in the mother's cordial and the compound syrup of Michela. This is Michela, its Latin name. So it's really, this is where it shines. It's the primary herb in the labor prep formulas. King's says to use, King's King's American Dispensatory is an eclectic literature from the 19th century, says to use 2 drops 3 or 4 times a day for the last 4 months of pregnancy as a simple, just using as a simple herb. Harvey Wicks Felter says, based on practice and traditions of the North American Indians, this plant was adopted into domestic and early botanic and eclectic therapy. It is said to have a salutary influence on the pregnant woman, easing many distresses, giving a sense of well-being, and strengthening her for the ordeal of childbirth. It was also known as a female regulator, a tonic, a diuretic, and astringent, used for amenorrhea, lack of cycles, or for dysmenorrhea, painful periods. Aviva Romm in modern times talks about that it can be used throughout pregnancy, and that it's most beneficial the last 4 to 6 weeks, but it's totally safe to take any time. And it's highly esteemed for preparing for birth. It's said to tone the muscles, promote gentle relaxation, reduce backaches, leg cramps, anxiety, and tension, and tones the urinary tract. So she does a lot of great things for us. And then on the screen there, it says it is par excellence, the Partus Preparator. They really considered this to be what it was used for, to prepare for birth. Susan Weed says you can use this plant as a tea in the last 4 to 6 weeks of pregnancy to strengthen and prepare, not as an infusion, but just as an herbal tea. Or 20 to 30 drops of tincture in a cup of red raspberry tea twice a day. You can also use it for irregular menses and first trimester bleeding.
Adrienne, can I ask why we are not to call it squaw vine?
Squaw is derogatory.
That's why for who? The native peoples?
Yeah,
okay,
it was a term used to describe Native American women, and it's a derogatory term.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Okay, so here is Viburnum opulus. This is also known as Gelder Rose, high bush cranberry. It's in the Caprifoliaceae family. It's cramp bark. The part used is the dried bark of the root or the stem. It grows from North America up into, from the United States up into Canada, kind of north of Missouri and Tennessee and Virginia on up north. And ethnobotanically, it was used for menstrual pain or other spasmodic pain. The eclectic indications are for uterine irritability and colic or spasm, or dysmenorrhea, painful periods with scanty flow. Let's see. They also used it for miscarriage prevention as a strong fluid extract. So fluid extract is typically an alcohol and water combination, a teaspoon every 30 minutes. And black haw and cramp bark are cousins. And some of the older literature describes how they're both used and how they're similar and how they're different. But cramp bark is opulus, black haw is Viburnum prunifolium. They say they're both antispasmodic, but cramp bark has more of an affinity for the lungs, and the black haw has more of an affinity for the uterus. So it's interesting that cramp bark was in all these old formulas when black haw really is what now they're saying is more of a uterine influence. Let's see, they used both for menstrual pain or other spasmodic pain, delayed menses. They say Viburnum opulus or cramp bark affects the nervous system, and Viburnum prunifolium, black haw, is a uterine tonic for weakness or prolapse. Let's see. It's anti-inflammatory, antispasmodic, astringent, unnerving, and sedative, specifically a uterine sedative. So it can calm down, annoying cramps, Braxton Hicks contractions if somebody's having them every night and they're like, oh, am I going to go into labor or not? Is this the night or not? I don't know what's going on. I'm just having all these toning contractions all the time. They can have some black haw or cramp bark and it should calm everything down. It's great postpartum, menstrual cramps, spasmodic coughs. The caution is if somebody's allergic to salicylates, because it does contain some salicylates. So if they have a bad reaction to aspirin, this is not their herb. Let's see. Jill Stansbury, the naturopath and herbalist, talks about that this helps coordinate the muscles and decrease pain. That antispasmodic is not the same as anti-tone. So I think some people are concerned using this postpartum because they want the womb to clamp down, right? And be nice and firm and not to bleed. This still allows the uterus to have tone, but also is antispasmodic. So it's going to calm down some of the painful contractions, but still keep things nice and tight. It is said to be a reliable uterine tonic, great in the last trimester for somebody with a history of postpartum hemorrhage, great for grand multiparas, people with fibroids. Let's see. Yeah, prevents those irregular contraction patterns and warm-up contractions. It can reduce arterial blood pressure. So another caution is people who have low blood pressure to start with. It might be hypotensive for them. How are we doing on time, Rachel?
It's about 10 till 1.
Okay, super, thank you. Caulifilum, this is blue cohosh, and they're little blue tinged berries. Caulifilum, blue cohosh, was used ethnobotanically for menstrual cramps to facilitate birth, to encourage placental birth, and there's only an occasional mention to use it to bring an overdue labor as an actual uterine stimulant to get things going. It's really used more during the birth process, according to ethnobotany sources. It was listed in the US Pharmacopoeia from 1882 to 1905 as a labor stimulant and as a tea to suppress profuse menses. All the 19th century herbal folks recommended it for stalled labor. So the eclectics, the physiomedicalists, the Thomsonians, they all used it in that regard. Felter and Lloyd says it's for uterine pain with fullness, weight, and pain in the legs, spasmodic muscular pain, a fullness of the tissues as if congested, as an oxytocic, to relieve false pains and uterine irritability, spasmodic uterine contractions, dysmenorrhea, irregular menses. They say it's a tonic for the last 3 months of pregnancy, prevents prematurity, and keeps the gestation until full term. That's the same thing. They say it's indicated for a rigid os in labor, so a rigid cervical os, increases the strength of contractions. It combines very well with viburnum or cramp bark for miscarriage and for after pains. They say its use creates confinement a matter of short duration. It's also good for severe after pains, hourglass contractions, false labor pains, hysteria with ovarian irritation. Dr. King says it expedites delivery when the delay is due to fatigue, debility, weakness, or want of uterine energy. So that was his specific indication. Somebody's really tired, worn out, weak. That's where this herb shines. Caulifilum is from the Greek kalos, meaning stem, and phylon, meaning leaf. Algonquin, the Algonquin language gives us cohosh, which means rough with hairs. And the two cohoshes are actually not related at all. They're in totally different plant families. It grows east from the East Coast to Oklahoma. Again, it's another eastern woodland plant because that's where North America was at the time when they were, discovering, writing down and codifying the use of all these plants. That's where the United States were. It's a perennial. It likes to grow in the shade. It grows up to Canada and south to Alabama and Georgia. It's also called blueberry root, blue ginseng, papoose root, sweet root, and squaw root. And there were actually many plants that were labeled squaw root back in the day. The ethnobotany of it, did I say ethnobotany already? I know I did the eclectic use. The ethnobotany, yes, I did. Okay. What else do I want to say? Historically, the forms used were as a tea. It was used as a decoction. It was very rarely used as a powder, and the powder was decocted in water. It was very, very rarely used as a tincture. So preparing it in alcohol, they've now shown actually brings out some of those rascally alkaloids that can cause side effects in babies. So historical use, tea. Never taken gross as a capsule, as a powder, then taken, and ingested in its raw form. It was always transformed by hot water. The Thomsonian herbalists, they used really high amounts of herbs often, but this one they didn't. This one they used tiny amounts. Modern use, its actions are bitter and sweet, it's warming, it's drying. Cheryl Tilgner, the naturopath and herbalist, says it increases blood flow to the pelvis. Side effects can cause nausea and vomiting, headache, muscle weakness, cardiovascular collapse, convulsions, tachycardia, hypertension, respiratory depression, pupil dilation, uncoordination. Susan Weed says, don't use it alone. It can cause a precipitous birth. She also notes that when you use it, you might see fetal heart tone changes. That was before all the studies came out in the 90s and early 2000s about what it might be doing to babies. It's often used in other herbs and formula. Seldom was it used alone. So the first case report for blue cohosh came in 1996, and Aviva Ram did her Yale doctoral thesis on this herb and on the use of it historically and modern times. There was a case report in 1998. Somebody took tablets of the herb 3 times a day for 3 weeks, and the baby had a heart attack, congestive heart failure, and she herself had a precipitous labor. Another case report came through in 2004 that the newborn had a stroke and seizures. The person was 40 weeks and their OB had recommended a tea to stimulate labor. The toxicology report showed metabolites of cocaine. So not sure if, it was a contaminated product, if the person was also using cocaine, it's really not clear. And then in 2005, Dr. Tironi Lodog, who's an herbalist and a doctor and has some experience with birth too, she just flat out recommended avoiding its use in pregnancy. So take that what you will. The next plant is black cohosh, which used to be called Simicifuga. Now it's called Actea. Simicus is insect, and fugari means to drive away. And that another one of its names is bugbane. And another name is black snake root. It was actually called black snake root for a lot of its US history. It's also known as cattle root, squaw root, and macrotis. You'll see it a lot in the old literature as macrotis. It also is an eastern woodland plant. It was in the US Pharmacopoeia from 1820 to 1926 and the National Formulary from 1935 to 1950. It was used for scarlet fever, smallpox, whooping cough, and rheumatism. It was a famous ingredient in Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for female complaints. The ethnobotanical use was to ease childbirth and to ease after pains. It's bitter and pungent and cooling and drying, and it grows from the Ozarks to Appalachia is especially where it grows. It's very easily cultivated. It has cousins in the Western United States. One of its cousins is baneberry, which is another Actea plant. It is used for pelvic congestion. It improves circulation. It is a vasodilator, so it can lower blood pressure. The Lloyd brothers, who are eclectic physicians, say it is the remedy for unpleasant sensations in the pregnant uterus, for false pains, and to aid true ones. It is undoubtedly a Partus Preparator whenever the woman is troubled with unpleasant sensations in the last months of pregnancy. Dr. John King says it's for tense, dull, aching, dragging pain, and it sedates the nerves of the womb. Modern times, it's considered to use fresh Fresh herb is safer than dry, or not safer, more superior. You get more of the active components if you do tincture of the fresh root. It's mildly sedating and nervine. It's antispasmodic. It's good for joint inflammation. It's an emmenagogue if menses is suppressed due to nervousness. Someone who's got like a slow starting menses and they just need to unwind, that's where this plant really shines. Matthew Wood talks about the mental and emotional indications of this plant, that it's for someone who has dark, gloomy depression, someone with dark, twisted, and emotional congestion, or magnetic people who attract abusive situations and abusive relationship patterns. It's contraindicated in high doses. It can cause a headache, dizziness, irritated nervous system. The headache tends to be frontal, and the antidote for the frontal headache is a nice strong cup of green tea. In high doses, it can also cause upset stomach and nausea and vomiting. It's less likely to be rascally if used in a formula. Avoid in people who have low blood pressure or someone who takes blood pressure medications. Dr. John King says it's the safest and most effective herb for after pains. There was one case report in 2016 you should be aware of. A 39-year-old primipara who developed hyponatremia in labor. She transferred intrapartum when fully dilated, and her lab work revealed the hyponatremia. It was unclear if she actually did take black cohosh and what form she took. It was said in the report she took several doses, and then later in the article it discusses a homeopathic remedy. So I'm not sure if it was a homeopathic remedy or an herbal preparation, if the author of the report was just unclear on what that means. A lot of people do conflate homeopathy and natural remedies, and they just call things homeopathic when they're not. So unclear, but that's just a caution to be aware of. And I'd like to compare the cohoshes. This is somewhat of an oversimplification of the cohoshes, but Susan Weed says you can use them together, that they work synergistically, not interchangeably, that they really shine when they complement one another, and you can see why. So I've listed their common name, their Latin name, their plant family, and then blue cohosh tones and contracts the uterus, whereas black cohosh is an antispasmodic, it relaxes the uterus. Blue cohosh is a vasoconstrictor. Black is a vasodilator. Blue cohosh is hypertensive and black cohosh is hypotensive. Blue is for prolonged labor. Black calms down a precipitous labor. Blue cohosh is for sharp shooting pains, especially of the uterus. Black cohosh is more for that dull, achy, draggy pain. And again, oversimplification, but interesting to put them side by side because they are often used together. So other herbs in the formulas, very briefly, lobelia is in a lot of them. That comes to us from the Thomsonian and physiomedical tradition. It's an antispasmodic. A lot of people say lobelia is like the brains of a formula. You put a little bit in the formula and it guides the herbs to where they need to go. Vervain is antispasmodic. It's a nervine and calming. It's really specifically indicated for people who have neck pain or tight necks. To me, I love it because I get neck pain. It just calms everything down. Vervain is emotionally indicated for people who are zealots, who have very strong beliefs and tend to impose their beliefs on other people. And you'll see that in some of the formulas. Wild yam is antispasmodic. It's antispasmodic for all smooth muscles. So it's great in pregnancy for threatened miscarriage. It's great for like a spasm of the gallbladder. It can calm that down. It is good for urinary irritation combined with other things. So wild yam is great. It is not progesteronic. It doesn't contain any progesterone or analogs to progesterone. That's a common myth in the herb world. So take that as what you will, but wild yam is great. It's antispasmodic. Pennyroyal is in some of the formulas, and pennyroyal has a maligned reputation too, because people have used the pennyroyal essential oil to try and cause an abortion. And what it really does is just poison their livers. But pennyroyal as an herb is great. It's antispasmodic. It is an emmenagogue. People have used it topically in like an herbal formula to calm menstrual cramps. So I think it's in some of these formulas also as a gentle like nudge to the uterus, but it's not super strong unless you use the essential oil, and you can't really hardly find the essential oil in commerce anymore because it's so dangerous. Blessed thistle is in some of the formulas. All thistles support the liver, which is great because we know our livers do so much extra work in pregnancy, processing all the extra blood volume and the hormones. So blessed thistle was actually mentioned by Shakespeare in Much Ado About Nothing. And it's an ingredient in Benedictine, the liqueur that's created by Benedictine monks. And in European folklore, it's grown around the homes to promote love and peace and harmony. And it's said to lift the spirits and improve memory. So I'm kind of curious why it was put into some of these formulas, but you know, if you can support your liver and lift your spirits, that's great, right? Bayberry myrica is astringent, and motherwort and skullcap are nervines. So I can see too why people would put them in their late pregnancy formulas. Sometimes people just get irritated late pregnancy, and this might be nice to help kind of smooth out the emotions. Ginger is there. Ginger is really warming. Ginger is a great circulatory herb, and it helps bring circulation specifically to the pelvis. So let's review the indications from the 19th century for these formulas. They were recommended for women who had multiple childbirths, tendency to habitual abortion or miscarriage, a history of difficult labors, a history of postpartum subinvolution, and also for pregnant women of a delicate or nervous disposition. For weak, nervous women is what they say. Now, who knows how much of that was just the Victorian mores of the time, and if it was wealthy women going to these eclectic physicians, you know, maybe they were wearing corsets and they were, you know, stuck inside in their homes instead of being outside, you know, experiencing activities like more rural women would do. So I'm curious, you know, when they were describing people of a delicate constitution, what actually were they seeing, and was that just a societal norm? The actions, it says, to impart energy to the uterine nervous system, and that to facilitate labor, removing late pregnancy cramps. And a key indication for the tissue state would be a laxity of the pelvic organs. So that's how they used it back then. Here's how people are using it now. Shonda Parker, in the Naturally Healthy Pregnancy book, says there are times when the hormonal activity of a pregnant mom may be needed to be encouraged with herbs. The hormonal assistance may need to be started prior to the due date in women who experience no noticeable Braxton Hicks contractions by the 34th week, or feeling no cervical twinges or pressure sensations by the 37th week. These herbs may be of benefit to the woman who has previous babies with post-maturity syndrome, the woman planning her first vaginal birth, or a mother past the 37th week with prolonged rupture of membranes. So she's using it as a stimulant, not just a tonic, it sounds like. The testimonials on the products from midwives and mothers, they say it causes a quicker labor, lower rate of transfers. Let's see. Shorter labors, efficient contractions, less painful labors, preventing postpartum hemorrhage. One person said it did provide lots of false labor, so that's interesting to hear. And the formulas are different. So let's look at the survey. There were 76 respondents, midwives of all different backgrounds. And the first question I asked was, do you routinely recommend these formulas? And people said that about 60% said no, about 30% said yes. And the people who said other said if people ask for something, then they'll recommend it, or people who have a history of post-dates pregnancy or a history of dysfunctional labor. Who do you recommend labor prep formulas to? Small amount, 16% said everyone. Now, I put multiparas and ground multiparas in there because looking at the historical literature, that's what it was recommended for. Nobody put multips on here. Everyone said they used them for primips. It was really interesting. And I didn't even have that as a category, but people wrote that in as an other response. A lot of people say they recommended it just because people wanted to take something, they wanted to do something. And I wonder about that, because what message are we sending to women about their bodies, right? Like, do we need something outside of ourselves to start our labor? It's really, I think, been seeded into the culture that that's what you do. You know, you get to 36 weeks, you start the dates, you start the raspberry, you take your Dr. Christopher capsules, and like, do we really need all these things? I'm not sure. We are different from, you know, our ancestors who were taking these herbs. nutrition's different, our lifestyles are different. So I think there's a place for them for sure. But it's sad to me that everyone wants to take something now. So people wrote in for question number 2, who do they recommend them to? No one. Primips, people with a history of long pregnancies, post-date pregnancies. Some people say history of IVF, but later on somebody said they don't recommend it for people with IVF histories, and I'm not sure why. People recommended it for PCOS, long-term hormonal birth control use. That's interesting. Like maybe their their endocrine system is a little out of balance, so they might need a nudge to get labor started. And then someone said for someone with a scarred cervix. And for a scarred cervix, personally, I would use evening primrose oil right on it, but they use the labor prep formula. So when do we recommend these formulas? When do we recommend they start? About a third of the people said 36 weeks. A few people said 37 weeks. A few people said 40. And then in the other, there was a split in this category between people who never recommend anything and people who gave me a variety of dates. So the dates they gave, there were a few at 34 weeks, a few at 35. Several people said 39 weeks is when they recommend starting. And then one person said 28. And I was like, whoa, 28. Okay, that's interesting. What formulas do you recommend? So the 2 that were recommended the most were the Dr. Christopher's birth prep formula, this one, and the Mountain Meadow Herbs formula. And then in the other category, about 50% of people, the responses were none. I hate that clients think they need them. I make my own. Individually selected herbs. One person, this is so lovely, a combination of partridge berry, rose hips, lemon balm, and they make a tea. Nora tea, borage oil, red raspberry leaves, dates, and sex. Evening primrose oil and red raspberry. One person said cotton root and black cohosh together. One person said 4 parts raspberry, 2 parts squaw vine or partridge berry. So there's a variety of things recommended. Question 5 is, do you see more Braxton Hicks or toning contractions with these? And it was actually about split down the middle with a little bit more tendency to see more. So more responses yes than no, but kind of an even split. What benefits do you observe? People said faster labors, easier labors, hard to say. Lack of postpartum hemorrhage, smoother postpartum recovery. I don't see benefits. By and large, the biggest response in the other category was fewer post-date pregnancies. Some people say they saw tons and tons of Braxton Hicks, which I don't see as a benefit, but that's what they responded. Let's see what else. Less bleeding, people have said. Some people said 5W formula, less bleeding, gentle birth formula, more bleeding. Some people said easier labor, but more prodromal, which is interesting, like an easier active phase. More false labor symptoms, higher dilation and effacement upon admission. And that was a person that said does not work for IVF people. More endurance and bravery, one person said. That's kind of cool. And then precautions. So what precautions do you give? That was just a fill in the blank thing. Several people said it may give false labor or prodromal labor or a fast hard labor. Irritable cervix, irritable uterus. A lot of people said greater postpartum potential, which is interesting because, right, the classic formulas, they said it would reduce or decrease postpartum hemorrhage. People said don't take more than recommended. Some people are concerned about the ingredients. One person said absolutely no cohosh of either kind, and I think maybe they're just confused about what black cohosh does. Several people wrote that they were concerned and cautioned people not to take any blue cohosh. And I think if the formula is a capsule, they have a good reason to caution that. Several people said wait till 37 weeks, only use with a supportive Bishop score. One person said this can lead to maternal exhaustion without any benefit. Hard and fast labors with stunned babies. Contraindications, don't use a VBAC, some people said, and I can see that with a VBAC. You might not want to use herbs that are uterine stimulating. You might want to just use tonic herbs like raspberry, maybe mitchella or partridge berry by itself, but nothing that's going to be too stimulating. Don't use if there's a history of preterm labor or irritable uterus. Don't take if allergies to any of the ingredients. Some person said cohosh can cause headaches, and actually either cohosh can cause a headache. So for sure, good warning. Don't use if you feel nauseous, hives, or have a headache. So that's a lot of information. Any questions, discussion, thoughts?
I have a question about using cotton root bark. One of the people that answered said they did just cotton root bark, and one of the cohoshes, was it black cohosh?
It was black, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that. I like wouldn't feel comfy using cotton root bark in pregnancy because of my experience with it.
Yeah.
In releases.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't studied that one as much to see if it's a tonic, but I haven't heard of any historic use of it as a uterine tonic. So I really do think, yeah, it's more of that stimulating category than the tonic category. So
yeah, I'm curious. Did the person that say cotton root bark and black cohosh, did they say like any results they've had with it in your
no, and it was
questionnaire?
like a survey monkey thing. So it was a lot of just answer the question and fill in the blank. But
yeah,
I can go back through. There were a few of them, like the one who said IVF. Like I can go back through and look at the individual responses because it might be neat to see like the pattern of what they said overall. So I can go back and look and let you know.
Cool. Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I know.
Right, 'cause maybe they're thinking more like labor induction rather than preparation, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I would use it as an induction herb, not prep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, or in labor to enhance, you can use it because it's got like oxytocic properties. So you can use it to enhance in labor. The one time I've used it a lot to enhance the labor, the person actually had an abruption because she had developed a Bandel's ring too. And that's the only Bandel's ring I've ever seen. So now I'm like, yeah, with the cotton root, you know? Yeah. Do you guys have experience with cotton root?
I use it pretty often for inductions. So that's a part of my protocol. Haven't had any, you know, obvious direct issues with it.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Hey, Adrienne, can you take off the screen so we can see people's faces?
Oh,
here, that's me. I can do that. Hold on one sec.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remove spotlight. There it is.
Okay. Oh, and there's a chat. So were there any questions in the chat? Let's see. Oh, sorry, I don't feel good, Jen.
Yeah, the whole time you were talking, I was just kind of thinking like, well, why do we want shorter labors? Why do we want less pain? Or, you know, like just thinking about kind of like, yeah, what is the why behind this? And kind of what you're saying, that it's like, you know, do we need these? And for who does need these, or who does want to take these, and just kind of really considering that part of this, you know, because of course, like it's beautiful that somebody who's had a 2-day labor, you know, and transfers to the hospital, that next time they take this, they get to have that beautiful home birth and shorter labor maybe. But yeah, I'm just in myself thinking like, I don't think I would take that, because, you know, it's like, okay, let me take notes for like what, you know, what I can tell people and what I'm going to do for myself. And just wondering like, I don't want to do that. You know, I would love to see what my body does on its own. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if other people have considerations about that, or.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts, because, you know, I was going through my notes and preparing, and I was like, this sounds amazing. Why wouldn't everybody want to take this? And I was like, but what message, what does it send to women that they need to take something outside of themselves in order to function, right?
Yeah, but I think, you know, I don't routinely recommend much beyond like red raspberry leaf, but I do say, like, you know, they always ask, what can I be doing? And I always say, you know, sleep, girl, sleep is what you should be doing. But, you know, if you feel like you need to and you want to be doing something, then look at it as that the herbs facilitate what your body's already doing. They're not going to make anything happen, but your body's already getting ready for birth. And so by, drinking your teas and doing your things, you're facilitating and supporting what your body's already doing. And I kind of just frame it that way. And I'm always sure to say, if you did nothing at all, the baby would still come out.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have the same thought. I'm always like, you don't need to do things. Your body works fine. Let's just let your body do its thing. But there are clients who are really scared. There are clients who have had, whose family history is with long, dysfunctional labors. And then there are people who, have a history of something, or their siblings do, or something like that. I'm interested. I've never used it for somebody with a history of hemorrhage, so I'm much more interested. Although my classic hemorrhage mom, who I helped with 5 babies, I think is done now. But so I can't try it with her. But I do have some people who every once in a while, they don't want to do active management, even though they had a big bleed. And so I kind of think, maybe that would, although a couple recently have agreed to immediate postpartum herbs instead of PIT or something. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I would use it like I do most medicine, with indication, but the indications could be emotional or psychological rather than physical. I recently had a mom who was VBAC and reported no Brax. She had reported Braxton Hicks contractions earlier, or toning contractions earlier in pregnancy, and then by like 39 weeks was really worried. She's like, I just realized I don't feel those anymore. Like, should I take something? Should I do something? And I'm always reluctant to prescribe much for VBAC moms, especially because her VBAC was for breech, not for a labor that didn't go well. And I told her I thought it was just how her body did it. And she went into labor at 40 and 4, something like that, and had a really functional early labor, and then precept and had the baby before we got there with no. So if we had put her on something, we would have felt like we had done that. But yeah, it was whatever it was. I mean, the person who most recently made me think, ooh, I should have something in my bags to say to her, ended up to be nothing. So
Adrienne, as you know, I also use a lot of homeopathy. So I've been wanting to take this class to kind of pair that homeopathic knowledge with the herbal knowledge. And so I really appreciated that you put the Latin root word on the side, because it helped me pair. I'm like, oh, I know this. Oh, I know this. And I also really appreciated your comments about black and blue. I look at them in the homeopathic side of things. And I, often I'm teaching homeopathic classes and people are like, well, I want to bounce black and blue cohosh or Simicifuga and cauliflower back and forth to get this mom into labor. And I'm like, homeopathically, that's not how it works. So I really appreciated, especially when you were talking about the blue and how you were saying it was listed as a stimulant for a short amount of time, but historically not. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, and I mean, in the and looking at the ethnobotany, whether that's accurate or not, from what we know, is they didn't use it as a labor stimulant. They used it during birth, but not before.
Yeah. And so just looking at the homeopathic side is going back to what someone just said recently was, I'm not looking to do, I also think like, oh, should I be telling moms to be doing this? I'm like, I don't function that way. I want to look at the individual person and what's going on and maybe offer something, but not automatically. And so I felt like that was just a reiterance of something I've already kind of figured out, but on the homeopathic side of things. So
one thing that's really,
Go ahead.
oh, sorry. one thing that's really on my mind as I look at this list is that sort of the intelligence of the plants, right? That if you look at something like partridge berry, being useful for, stopping first trimester bleeding and preventing miscarriage, and also being a birth tonic. So I have a formula that I make called Womb Calm that mostly I made it for the nurses and birth assistants at the birth center who are always pregnant and they're always contracting and dehydrated and they never pee and they're just always contracting with all their babies. And so that formula is partridge berry, black haw, lobelia, a couple other little things, but like a lot of this stuff. But then again, I use that same formula with Vitex as a fertility tonic. And then again, that same formula with valerian and skullcap for prodromal labor to like relax a woman and settle her down. So something like partridge berry, black haw, wild yam, like a lot of these antispasmodic like uterine tonics are really good for a whole variety of things, especially with an addition or subtraction of whatever. But that base formula goes everywhere in pregnancy and labor, and it's pretty cool.
Cool. Any other thoughts, questions?
Awesome. I just want to thank you, Adrienne, for sharing this wisdom and knowledge. And yeah, it was really cool to hear the history. I really enjoyed that. So I appreciate that. Yeah. Anything else before we sign off?
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne.